It's really good to be back here at the Geneva Summit, and believe me, this is not just a polite turn of phrase on my part. Just a few months ago, I was sitting in a 2-by-3 meter cell in solitary confinement at a strict regime prison in Siberia, thinking that this was what the rest of my life was going to look like. The prisoner exchange that freed 16 of us from the hell of Vladimir Putin's gulag last August has been described by the media, as Brandon just mentioned, as historic in many different ways. The largest prisoner swap between the East and the West since the time of the Cold War, a complex international operation involving 8 different countries, and we can list many other things, but what makes it really historic and really significant, to my mind, was Western democracy's insistence that it include not only their own citizens held hostage by the Putin regime, but also Russian political prisoners, the first exchange of this kind in nearly 4 decades. In our age of cynicism and realpolitik, this was a really powerful message of solidarity on the part of the free world with all those Russians who oppose Putin's dictatorship and who oppose his murderous war in Ukraine. But so many others are still left behind. According to publicly available and self-admittedly incomplete figures from human rights groups, today's Russia holds 1,497 political prisoners, more than the whole of the Soviet Union, that's 15 countries put together, did in the mid-1980s. And that number is growing constantly. This coming week alone, 243 people will be tried in courtrooms across Russia on politically motivated charges. And the fastest growing category in that list are people who have protested against the war in Ukraine. These protests have taken different forms. In the case of Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow municipal councillor, it was calling for a minute of silence at his district council meeting for Ukrainian children killed by Russian bombs. The price was 7 years in prison. In the case of Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist from Siberia, he was writing the truth about the Russian airstrike on a theater in Mariupol that left hundreds of civilians dead. The price was 6 years in prison. In the case of Dmitry Ivanov, a talented young mathematician who was arrested on the day of his final exam at Moscow State University before he could graduate, he was posting on social media about the war crimes committed by Russian forces in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine. The price was 8.5 years in prison. And the list goes on, more names than would be possible to mention. As ceasefire negotiations begin in the coming days, it is imperative that any deal to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine includes a provision on the release of all captives of this war, prisoners of war on both sides, as is required by the Third Geneva Convention. Ukrainian civilian hostages, thousands of them held in Russian detention facilities. Ukrainian children abducted to Russian territory, a war crime that has resulted in Vladimir Putin's indictment by the International Criminal Court. And Russian political prisoners, my fellow citizens who refuse to stay silent in the face of the atrocities committed by Putin's regime, even at the cost of their own freedom. Putin's propaganda wants the whole world to believe that all Russians support his regime, that all Russians back his war. But actions speak louder than words, and a spiral of repression, unparalleled since the Soviet era, tells a very different story. The hundreds who are imprisoned, the thousands who faced administrative charges, the tens of thousands detained by police at anti-war protests, the hundreds of thousands who signed petitions to get an anti-war candidate on the presidential ballot last year, these are the faces of a different Russia. The Russia Vladimir Putin does not want you to see. Not the Russia of murderers and war criminals who are sitting in the Kremlin, but the Russia of decent and good-hearted people who oppose them. Not the aggressive, belligerent, archaic Russia of today, but a hopeful, peaceful, democratic Russia of tomorrow. Whatever Putin may do to try to stop it, that tomorrow is coming. Let us work together to bring it closer. I thank you very much.